There is a part of you that you do not show anyone, not because you are hiding it deliberately, but because somewhere along the way, in childhood, in school, in the slow process of learning what was acceptable and what was not, you learned to push it down, to set it aside, to become the version of yourself that the world around you seemed to require. Carl Jung called what you pushed down the shadow, and he spent his career arguing that the parts of yourself you have rejected, denied, and buried are not gone. They are simply running your life from underneath, shaping your reactions, your relationships, your fears, and your patterns in ways you cannot see because you have never turned to look at them directly. This is part 1 of our journey through Jung's psychology. Tonight we begin at the beginning, with the shadow, with what it is, where it comes from, and what it costs you to keep pretending it is not there. Carl Gustav Jung was born in Switzerland in 1875 and spent his life doing something that most people find genuinely uncomfortable, looking honestly at the parts of human psychology that we prefer not to acknowledge. He was a student of Freud, who eventually broke with him, finding Freud's framework too narrow, too focused on sexuality as the root of psychological life, and not nearly curious enough about the deeper layers of the unconscious that Jung believed shaped human experience far more fundamentally. What Jung discovered, through his clinical work with patients, through his own intense and sometimes destabilizing self-examination, and through a lifetime of studying mythology, religion, and the patterns that recur across human cultures, was that the psyche is not a simple thing. It is layered. It contains dimensions that the conscious mind does not have direct access to, and that operate according to their own logic regardless of what the conscious mind would prefer. The shadow is one of those dimensions, and understanding it begins with a simple observation that once you hear it, you cannot unhear. From the very beginning of your life, you received messages about what was acceptable to feel, express, and be. Some of these messages were explicit. Don't be so angry. Stop crying. You're too sensitive. Be more like your sister. Boys don't do that. Girls shouldn't say that. Some were implicit. The subtle withdrawals of approval, the slight cooling in a parent's voice when you expressed something that made them uncomfortable, the way certain feelings were met with silence rather than response. Over time, through a process that is entirely normal and entirely universal, you learned which parts of yourself were welcome and which were not. The welcome parts stayed in the light, became part of how you presented yourself to the world, part of what you understood to be your personality, part of your conscious identity. The unwelcome parts went somewhere else. Jung called that somewhere else the shadow. It is not evil. It is not pathological. It is simply the repository of everything you have decided, or been told, does not belong in the version of yourself you show the world. It can contain rage and selfishness and cruelty, yes. But it can equally contain creativity, passion, directness, sexuality, ambition, wildness, qualities that were not acceptable in your particular environment, but that are not inherently negative at all. Many people's shadows contain their best qualities, buried because those qualities were inconvenient or threatening to the people who raised them. The shadow does not disappear because you have pushed it down. This is the central and most important thing Jung understood about it. Repression is not elimination. When you push something into the unconscious, you do not make it stop existing. You make it stop being visible to you. And things that are operating in you but not visible to you have enormous power, precisely because you cannot see them coming. Jung's famous formulation was this: Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment. The things about yourself that you haven't examined, not integrated, not acknowledged. They are not dormant. They are active. They are shaping your choices and your reactions and your relationships right now. You are simply calling their influence by other names. Bad luck, other people's fault, just the way things are. The most reliable way to find your shadow is to notice what makes you disproportionately angry. Not ordinarily annoyed, disproportionately angry. The reaction that is larger than the situation seems to warrant, the one that lingers after the moment has passed, the one that tells you something is being triggered rather than simply responded to. Jung called this projection. When we cannot acknowledge a quality in ourselves, when it is too threatening or too incompatible with our self-image to look at directly, we see it in other people instead. The person who cannot acknowledge their own dishonesty becomes intensely reactive to dishonesty in others. The person who has buried their aggression finds aggression in everyone around them. The person who has suppressed their desire for recognition is infuriated by people who seek it openly. The intensity of the reaction is the signal. It is pointing at something. This is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of shadow work. The recognition that the qualities you most dislike in other people are often the ones most present in your own unconscious. Not always. Sometimes you simply dislike something because it is genuinely problematic. But when the dislike has that particular heat to it, that personal quality that goes beyond reasonable objection into something that feels almost like an attack on you personally, Jung would say, "Look there." Something is being projected. The person you find most irritating in your life right now, the quality in them that bothers you most. Is it possible, not certain, but possible, that this quality exists in you in some form that you haven't fully acknowledged? That question is not comfortable. It is not meant to be. It is the beginning of honest self-examination, which is the only thing that actually changes anything. The shadow also shows up in our relationships, in the patterns we repeat, in the people we are drawn to, in the dynamics that seem to follow us from one situation to the next, regardless of the specific people involved. If you find yourself repeatedly in relationships where the same dynamic plays out, where you are always the caretaker, or always the one who is let down, or always the one who ends up angry, Jung would say that the pattern is not coming from outside you. It is being generated by something inside you that has not yet been seen. That is attracting certain kinds of situations because those situations resonate with something in the unconscious that is seeking, in its oblique and often counterproductive way, to be resolved. This is not blame. It is not a claim that what has happened to you is your fault. It is something more nuanced and more useful than blame. The recognition that patterns have sources, and that the source of your persistent patterns is more likely to be found inside you than outside you, which means it is also more likely to be something you can actually do something about. Jung was explicit that the goal of shadow work is not to eliminate the shadow, it is to integrate it. Integration means bringing what is unconscious into consciousness, not acting out everything you have repressed, not deciding that because your shadow contains aggression, you should now be aggressive, or because it contains selfishness, you have permission to be selfish. Integration means acknowledging these qualities as yours, seeing them clearly, understanding where they came from, and in doing so, taking back the power they have been exercising over you without your knowledge. A quality that you have acknowledged has less power over you than a quality you are pretending you do not have. The rage you know is yours can be worked with, channeled, understood. The rage you are convinced belongs entirely to other people. The rage you experience only as a reaction to what they are doing to you, runs your life, and you call it their fault. The first step is simply noticing. Jung called this developing the ego's relationship to the unconscious, the process by which the conscious mind begins to acknowledge that it is not the whole of the psyche, that there are forces operating below it that it does not control, and that the path forward is not to assert more control, but to develop a more honest relationship with what is actually there. In practice, this looks like paying attention to the moments when you react rather than respond. When something triggers you beyond what the situation warrants, when you find yourself in a familiar pattern and feeling the familiar frustration of not understanding why this keeps happening. It looks like asking, not in a spirit of self-punishment, but in a spirit of genuine curiosity, what is this reaction telling me about what I am carrying? What quality in this person or situation is activating something in me that I haven't fully acknowledged? It looks like sitting with discomfort rather than immediately resolving it. The shadow does not reveal itself to people who cannot tolerate uncertainty. It reveals itself slowly, in fragments, to people who have developed the capacity to look at themselves honestly without flinching away from what they find. Jung believed that this process, the turning toward the shadow, the beginning of honest self-examination, was the first and most necessary step in what he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming, as fully as possible, the person you actually are, rather than the person you were shaped to be. It is not a comfortable process. It does not produce a more placid or easier life in the short term. What it produces, gradually, unevenly, with significant resistance from the parts of us that prefer not to be examined, is a more honest one. A life in which you are the author of your patterns rather than their victim, in which your reactions tell you something useful about yourself rather than simply confirming your existing story about other people. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be acknowledged, to be seen, to be brought back into the wholeness of who you actually are, rather than left in the dark to cause damage from a distance. Turning toward it is the beginning of something. Jung called it awakening. Not because it is mystical, though he had room for the mystical, but because it involves, for the first time, seeing yourself more completely than you did before. Next time, we go deeper into Jung's map of the psyche with the persona, the mask you built to face the world, the price of wearing it too long, and what is waiting underneath it.